So I was going to go over a couple things. The correct way to pull these spindle bearings out is with a collet style puller. The collet style puller has fingers on it. You hold one part of it, turn this in, and it makes these fingers expand. So this would go in and hook like under the edge of the bearing and then pull it out. So this is, I'm just using this one to show you what they are. This is the correct size one in the spindle bearing, and it hooks to a slide hammer, and you can set it like on the edge of the table, the flange, and then use the slide hammer to whambo it out. I've had this OTC set up for years. It's like a 4 or 5 piece set. It's called a blind bearing puller set. And there's the OTC number. But that's the correct way to do it. You can take like a screwdriver or a junk one in your toolbox and bend the tip just at the end so you can get on the inside and you can catch the top of the bearing and drive it out. But this is the correct way with the collet style puller. I'll show you a couple things over here on this axle too. So I loosened the ball joint nuts. I still have a couple threads holding, and then I used a pickle fork on the lower ball joint, drove that in, and it popped the 2 ball joints out of the taper. On these early Cj axles, well, any Cj ball joint axle, be careful, there's a spanner nut on this top one, and if you go driving the pickle fork in there, you can kind of dick this up. These don't always come with the ball joint sets, these spanner nuts, and they're kind of tricky to find nowadays. So I would suggest driving the pickle fork in the lower one. This is what I mean when I say pickle fork. It's a wedge shaped tool to separate ball joints and tie rod ends. And then on these axles, I did remember and figure out what was going on. So I showed you guys the seals inside those spindles, and they were kind of concaved. Wasn't placing really what was going on. And then I remembered that they did have different stubs for disc and drum brakes. The disc brake stubs, this is a little bigger diameter here than the drum brake stubs. The drum brake stubs, this sits on the inside of that steel. So what I had going on is they have the spindles and the seals for drum brake stubs, and then these stubs here are disc brake stubs. So wrong stubs for the spindle setup. You could use these stubs with those spindles. You would just have to use the other style seal, and I think that's about it. Yeah, the other size style seal. The other thing is on the drum brake stubs, instead of having a plastic thrust washer here, these ones had the plastic thrust washer. This would be a bronze or a brass thrust washer in here, and it's a little different diameter. So that's what I had going on. So you never know what you're gonna get at a junkyard. This is all mismatched stuff, and when you're pulling stuff apart that at the earliest is almost 40 years old now, 1986 was the last year that they used this stuff. This stuff's earlier than that, but when you're pulling apart 40-year-old stuff, who knows what's been done to it. A guy's just trying to get the thing back together to drive it to work on Monday. So like I said, not anything super uncommon to have mismatched stuff. Just I figured out what was going on. So I'm using chromolyes. They use the later size, like the disc brake dimensions. So I'm going to use the rubber seals, not the lip seal. And I'll go over that stuff when I'm putting it together. Flashing back to the rear axles real quick. These bearings are pressed on, so you have a retainer plate, axle seal, a bearing, a race. The race was stuck in the housing, and then a bearing retainer. And the bearing retainer and the bearing are all pressed on. Typically when you take these apart, you have to take a die grinder, cut the retainer, bust the cage on the bearing, cut the inner race. You don't want to cut all the way into the axle. You want to cut about 75 to 90% of the way through, and then split the race and the retainer with the chisel. It's just dangerous. You can, get something in your eye or your hand or something. So Yukon came up with a tube attachment that hooks to their differential bearing puller, and it allows you to pull all that at once. So I'll do a little video on demonstrating that in just a second. So Yukon makes this tube adapter that goes on rear axle shafts that will pull the seal bearing and retainer off at one time. Thing works great. Works, I would say, about 90% of the time, which is pretty good odds. So it uses their standard clamshell bearing puller for differentials and pinion bearings up here, and then it has this tube and another clamshell. So I have this one started. I'll finish pulling it and show you. About ran out of space there, so get this apart. So the two clamshell halves, the Yukon differential puller. When these short little axles, I had to use this adapter for the bigger carrier bearing journals. Then the axle clamshell bearing, and the tube. There's the bearing retainer plate, and the seal, the bearing, and the retainer all off in one pull, no cutting. So pretty cool setup. Check out Yukon for this puller, or the differential bearing puller. It works great. So I'm going to get this other one pulled off and then clean the shafts up, get them ready to go back in. Getting ready to take these ball joints out, I wanted to go over a couple things. The biggest mistakes I'm seeing when people are taking out ball joints is they haven't figured out which direction the ball joint was originally pressed in. So when they go to remove it, they're not able to press it the opposite way to get it out. And sometimes this is kind of tricky. If you're having a hard time with this, get out the new ball joint. This isn't a new one, but get out the new ball joint. And most ball joints have a shoulder on one side, and it was typically pressed in on that shoulder side, so that part went in the hole last, so that part has to come out of the hole first. So that's a good way to tell that. The second mistake is a lot of ball joints fit multiple applications, and a lot of them have snap ring grooves that aren't used, but people aren't taking snap rings off, and they're blowing out knuckle holes or ruining control arms or doing all kinds of stuff. So make sure if you try to locate a snap ring groove, try to make sure that there's not a snap ring in there, or part of a snap ring that's part of it's rotted off or something like that. And then just be smart when you're pressing these ball joints out. If it's not going, or you think it's taking excessive force, stop, check, make sure you're going the right way. Make sure you're not bottoming out your tool. So I started to do this not thinking real precisely, and I didn't have this this extra tube on here, and it would have pressed it up and it would have bottomed out on the end of this screw here. It wouldn't have had room for the stud to go anywhere. So it wouldn't have probably hurt anything, but it would have went and stopped, and then I would have had to take it apart and say, hey, what's going on here? It's not going. And I would have realized that it's pushing it into the end of the screw and bottoming out. So the ball joint tool that I've had the best luck with is this Snap-on one. Real user friendly. The tool has spring steel clips down here, like similar to a snap ring, and it holds these cups in position, even the two cups on each other in position. So you can basically just hold the tool and run the screw. You don't have to hold these cups, they're not loose. Pretty slick, pretty nice puller. You can clamp it in a vise and use it on U-joints and stuff like that too. So I'll show you the part number real quick if you're interested. I do have a few extra cups in here for an additional add-on cup set. So great tool, not super die-hard Snap-on only type guy, but this is a really great tool. So check it out if you're interested.